The courtroom buzzed with a thick air of anticipation, every seat filled with people who had come to witness the fall of a giant. Photographers clustered near the back, their cameras poised, ready to capture the image of the billionaire who had once been untouchable. Lawyers shuffled papers, journalists whispered predictions, and murmurs from the public gallery rippled like an undercurrent of judgment. At the center of it all sat Adrian Cole, a man whose name had built empires and shattered competitors. His tailored suit fit perfectly, but the weight of accusation bent his shoulders ever so slightly. For years, he had been known as the ruthless CEO, sharp, brilliant, and merciless. Now he was just another man facing justice, accused of fraud, corruption, and crimes that, if proven, would strip him of everything. The judge, an older man with a heavy gavel and a heavier glare, cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice carrying authority, "after weeks of testimony and evidence presented against you, this court is prepared to deliver its judgment." The hush that fell over the room was suffocating. Adrian clenched his jaw, trying not to betray the flicker of unease that passed through his eyes. He had fought battles in boardrooms and on trading floors, but here, in this room, he was defenseless. The gavel lifted, ready to strike, ready to pronounce the verdict that could end him. And then, the heavy courtroom doors burst open with a sharp crash, making heads whip around. Gasps broke out as a boy stumbled inside, breathless, clothes torn and dirt-streaked. He couldn't have been more than 13, his hair unkempt, his shoes mismatched and worn thin. He stood at the threshold, chest heaving, then shouted with a voice that trembled but carried through the chamber. "Don't hurt him, he's my father." Silence, absolute silence. For a heartbeat, even the judge froze. Then came a wave of chaos. Reporters leapt to their feet, cameras flashing wildly as though they had struck gold. The public gallery erupted in disbelief, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. Who is this boy? Is he lying? What does he mean? Adrian Cole's head snapped toward the child, his carefully controlled composure breaking for the first time. His eyes narrowed, searching the boy's face, and something in his chest tightened. Could it be? "Order," the judge thundered, striking his gavel until the room reluctantly quieted. He leaned forward, his eyes on the boy. "Who are you? This is a court of law, not a place for interruptions." But the boy Ethan stood his ground, small shoulders squared with a determination that seemed far too great for his frail frame. His voice cracked with desperation as he cried, "I'm Ethan, and I have proof. He's my father, and I can show you the truth. Please, you can't punish him without hearing me." A ripple of shock swept through the room again. Adrian Cole, the billionaire accused of crushing the poor, stared at the ragged boy who claimed to be his son. For the first time that day, Adrian wasn't thinking about prison or money. He was staring into eyes that looked hauntingly familiar, eyes that mirrored his own. And in that instant, the trial everyone thought was about to end had only just begun. Ethan had not always known hunger, but hunger had always known him. His earliest memories were not of warm cribs or bedtime stories, but of shadows stretching across damp alleys, of his mother's weary arms carrying him from one shelter to another. She had loved him fiercely, that much he remembered. Her cracked hands, her tired smile, her soft lullabies whispered under the noise of a city that never cared. But poverty had a way of erasing even the strongest love. By the time Ethan was 5, his mother's health had begun to decline. She coughed more than she laughed, and some nights he would wake to see her clutching her chest, gasping for air. Still, she tried to protect him from the truth, feeding him the last pieces of bread while she went hungry. He never forgot the night she whispered, "You're stronger than you know, Ethan. One day you'll find where you belong." That day came too soon. She passed quietly one winter evening, leaving Ethan with nothing but a threadbare blanket and a small tin box she had guarded for years. He was alone, an orphan swallowed by the streets. The city was merciless to children like him. Ethan learned quickly that survival meant adaptation. He carried bags for strangers, wiped windshields at traffic lights, and begged outside bakeries where the smell of bread tortured him. Sometimes he slept beneath bridges, other times in abandoned buildings with other homeless children who formed a kind of makeshift family. They shared scraps of food, looked out for one another, and huddled together for warmth. Yet Ethan was different from most. He had a sharpness in his eyes, a resourcefulness that even the older kids respected. He figured out how to fix broken shoes with bits of wire, how to read half-torn newspapers people threw away, how to dodge the police who scattered them from street corners. The world had hardened him, but it had not taken away his kindness. If he found food, he split it. If someone younger was bullied, Ethan defended them. His mother's words, "You're stronger than you know," never left him. Years later, when he turned 12, Ethan finally opened the tin box his mother had left behind. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, was a faded photograph. A man in a sharp suit, tall and confident, with the kind of presence that dominated a room. Beside the photo lay a folded birth document with a name scrawled clearly across it, Adrian Cole. Ethan stared at the name for hours, his mind a whirlwind. Adrian Cole, the billionaire everyone in the city knew, the man who appeared on magazine covers, the tycoon whose empire towered over the skyline. The man, it seemed, who was his father. At first, anger filled Ethan. If this man was his father, why had his mother died in poverty? Why had he grown up cold and hungry while Adrian Cole dined in luxury? To Ethan, it was proof of cruelty, of abandonment. He swore he would never forgive the man who had left them to suffer. But curiosity gnawed at him. He began to watch Adrian from afar, sneaking into business conferences, studying newspaper articles, listening to men on the streets talk about the billionaire's trial. And slowly, a new truth surfaced. Adrian Cole was not untouchable anymore. The empire he built was crumbling, his enemies circling like vultures, his reputation on the verge of ruin. For days, Ethan wrestled with himself. Should he let the man who might be his father fall, or should he step forward and reveal the truth his mother had hidden? The decision came the night before Adrian's sentencing. Ethan held the photograph close and whispered to the stars above, "If you really are my father, I won't let them destroy you without a fight." The next morning, with nothing but his mother's box, the documents, and courage that came from years of surviving the streets, Ethan walked into the courtroom. And the world would never be the same. Adrian Cole had once been a name spoken with awe. To the business world, he was the man who turned failing industries into gold, a visionary with the instincts of a predator. But to the people who worked under him, he was ruthless. Competitors called him the Iron Wolf, because when he moved in, no rival survived. He had everything: wealth, power, the admiration of some, and the fear of many. Yet as he sat in that courtroom, facing the judge's unforgiving stare, Adrian felt the weight of his empire crashing down. The prosecutors painted him as a monster who grew rich off corruption, exploiting workers and bending laws to suit his ambitions. Some of it was true, he admitted silently. He had made deals that danced on the line between legal and criminal. He had always justified it as necessary for survival in a world where only the strongest endure. But there was one secret even the prosecution didn't know. Years ago, when he was still young and hungry for success, Adrian had fallen in love with a woman far outside his world. She had been gentle, selfless, everything he was. Their affair had been short-lived, torn apart by the growing gulf between his ambition and her quiet life. When she left, she vanished without a trace, taking with her something he hadn't known at the time, their child. He had searched years later when regret began to gnaw at him. He hired investigators, followed rumors, even looked through adoption agencies, but nothing ever led to her or the child. Eventually, he buried the memory, convincing himself it was too late. He drowned his guilt in work, in wealth, in power. And now this boy. When Ethan burst into the courtroom, Adrian's first instinct had been disbelief. Another street child trying to scam him. He had seen it before, children who claimed relation, begging for money. But when Ethan shouted the words, "He's my father," something inside Adrian faltered. The boy looked fragile, yet in his posture there was defiance. His voice carried the same unshakable edge Adrian had once used to command boardrooms. And when Adrian looked closer, he saw it, those sharp gray eyes, eyes that mirrored his own. The courtroom buzzed with ridicule, journalists whispered and snickered. "Another stunt," someone muttered. A rival attorney smirked. This is pathetic, pulling orphans off the street to play the son card. Laughter followed, cruel and mocking. Adrian clenched his fists under the table. The old Adrian, the one who crushed opposition, wanted to lash out at them to silence their insults, but this was different. This was personal. The judge, trying to maintain order, demanded proof, and Ethan, trembling but unbroken, produced the documents from his mother's tin box. The birth certificate with Adrian's name. The photograph from years ago, showing Adrian in his younger days, standing beside Ethan's mother. Even a small pendant, an engraved gift Adrian remembered giving long ago. The room grew quiet. Lawyers leaned forward, frowning. Reporters scribbled furiously. Suddenly, this wasn't a cheap stunt anymore. Adrian's enemies tried to laugh it off. Forged papers, they jeered. The boys lying to get attention, what homeless kid would? But Adrian couldn't shake the truth pressing down on him. The resemblance was too strong. The evidence too real. And the fire in Ethan's eyes, it wasn't the gaze of a liar. It was the gaze of a boy who had suffered, who carried years of pain, and yet still stood there, protecting the man the world wanted to destroy. For the first time in years, Adrian felt his carefully built walls crack. If this boy truly was his son, then the life he had abandoned was staring him in the face, demanding recognition. The courtroom could laugh, his rivals could mock, but Adrian Cole knew one thing: this was no scam. This was blood, his blood. And that truth terrified him more than the trial itself. The silence in the courtroom was so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone. All eyes were on Ethan, the boy who had just interrupted a billionaire's trial with words no one expected. "Don't hurt him, he's my father." The judge, visibly impatient, adjusted his glasses. "You say you have proof," he said sternly. "Show us." Ethan's hands shook as he reached into the small satchel slung over his shoulder. The bag looked worn and patched, clearly the only possession he carried. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, then carefully laid the items on the table before him. His voice trembled, but his determination was clear. "This was my mother S," he said softly, unfolding a creased photograph. The image showed a younger Adrian Cole standing beside a smiling woman. She was thinner, humbler than the women Adrian had been seen with in the media, but there was no denying the resemblance between the boy and the man in the photo. Adrian's jaw clenched as he recognized her instantly, the woman he had once loved and lost. Gasps echoed through the room. Ethan placed the next item on the table, a pendant with a small engraving. Adrian inhaled sharply. He remembered that pendant. He had given it to Ethan's mother when she told him she was pregnant, a promise that he would always be there. He had failed that promise, but the pendant had endured. Finally, Ethan pulled out a folded birth certificate, its edges frayed, but the ink still legible. And there it was, his own name, Ethan Cole, and in the father's column, Adrian Cole. The room erupted into whispers. Cameras flashed like lightning. The judge called for order, striking his gavel until the chaos dimmed. "This doesn't prove anything," one of the prosecuting lawyers barked. "Documents can be forged, photos can be faked. This is a circus stunt, and the boy is an opportunist." Ethan turned toward the lawyer, his thin frame trembling but his voice steady. "It's not a stunt. My mother told me the truth before she died. She said my father wasn't heartless, that once he helped her when no one else would." His eyes flicked to Adrian, full of pain and unspoken questions. "She said you gave her money once, enough for food and medicine. She said she believed you loved her." Adrian's chest tightened. He remembered that day vividly. He had slipped her money before leaving, thinking it would buy her time, thinking he would return. But he never did. The lawyer sneered. "Touching story, but what do you, a homeless street rat, know about this court, about justice?" Ethan drew in a shaky breath, his fists clenched at his sides. "I know suffering, I know hunger, I know what it's like to sleep on the cold ground while people like you walk past without seeing us. But I also know my father's face. I know his eyes because they are mine, and no matter how much the world hates him, I will not let them destroy my father without the truth." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the reporters lowered their cameras, stunned by the boy's courage. The judge studied Ethan, then glanced at Adrian, who sat frozen in his chair. Slowly, the judge nodded. The boy will be allowed to testify. The prosecution erupted in protest, shouting objections, but the gavel silenced them. The judge's voice rang firm. This court values truth wherever it comes from. If the boy has something to say, he will be heard. Ethan straightened, a spark of pride igniting in his weary eyes. For the first time in his life, people weren't dismissing him as a beggar. They were listening. Adrian, staring at the fragile yet unbreakable boy who bore his name, felt a pang he had long forgotten: hope. And as Ethan prepared to tell his story, everyone in that courtroom sensed the trial had just shifted into something far greater than wealth, power, or crime. It had become a battle for truth, blood, and redemption. The courtroom air felt heavier than ever. Adrian Cole, once untouchable, now sat chained to the defense table, his empire hanging by a thread. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for Ethan to speak. What none of them expected was that the boy's testimony would drag hidden shadows into the light. Ethan glanced nervously around the room. His hands fidgeted with the edges of his worn shirt, but his voice carried steady determination. My father is not the monster they say he is. The real criminals are sitting among us, pretending to be his friends. A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. The prosecuting lawyer immediately rose. Objection, this is outrageous speculation. But the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of the gavel. Let the boy continue. We will decide what is speculation and what is truth. Ethan took a deep breath, recalling the countless nights he had spent huddled near alleys and back doors, surviving on scraps. Those dark corners had given him ears that the wealthy underestimated. While I lived on the streets, he began, I stayed near the places where powerful men met. Hotels, restaurants, clubs. I pretended to be invisible. Nobody notices a hungry boy sweeping or begging outside. But I listened, and I heard things. He paused, scanning the faces of the board members who had been attending the trial daily, each pretending to grieve over Adrian's downfall. His eyes locked on one man in particular, Victor Harrington, Adrian's longtime business partner. Harrington sat stiffly, his expression betraying a flicker of unease. I heard them talking about how Adrian Cole was too powerful, too difficult to control, Ethan said. His voice gained strength with every word. They said they would destroy him and take his company for themselves. They mentioned rigging accounts, planting evidence, even paying off witnesses. I didn't understand it all then, but I do now. The audience erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order again. Ethan pressed on. One night outside the Golden Crest Hotel, I saw Harrington with two other men. They didn't know I was there. They laughed about how the charges against Adrian were already in motion and soon Cole Industries would belong to them. They said, and I remember this clearly, the great Cole won't know what hit him. Victor Harrington's face flushed red. He slammed his hand on the bench. Lies, this boy is delusional. But before the court could calm, another voice rose. A timid woman in the gallery stood up. Your Honor, she said, wringing her hands nervously, I worked at the Golden Crest. I was a maid there. I also overheard those men. What the boy says is true. Gasps filled the chamber. The prosecution tried to shout her down, but the judge gestured for silence. Step forward and state your name for the record, he ordered. The woman, trembling but resolute, introduced herself and repeated what she had heard. The puzzle pieces began to align, and suddenly Adrian's defense didn't seem like desperation. It seemed like revelation. Ethan turned back to his father. His voice broke but remained firm. They set you up, Father. I may not know everything about business, but I know betrayal when I hear it, and I swear I will not let them win. The courtroom sat frozen, the balance of the trial shifting before their eyes. For the first time, the once all-powerful board members looked cornered, their confidence faltering. Adrian, eyes fixed on the boy who bore his blood, felt his heart clench with something he hadn't felt in years: pride. The judge leaned forward. These are serious accusations. This court will hear more testimony on this matter. If there has been a conspiracy against Mr. Cole, the truth will be brought to light. Harrington's mask slipped, a trace of panic showing. For years he had plotted in the shadows, certain his power was unshakable. Yet now, undone by the testimony of a boy he had dismissed as a nobody, his empire of lies began to crack. And in that moment, Adrian realized that his son, the child he had failed to protect, was now protecting him. The tide had turned. The judge called for a brief recess after the explosive revelations. The courtroom emptied into hushed whispers, but Adrian Cole barely heard any of them. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan, the boy who had just stood before the world and defended him with courage no seasoned lawyer could match. Adrian's hands trembled slightly as he approached. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice stripped of its usual authority, "come with me." They were escorted into a private chamber. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with years of absence and unspoken truths. Finally, Adrian broke it. "I owe you the truth," he said, his voice unsteady. "I didn't know where you were all these years. I tried to find you, but I failed. And I failed your mother, too. I let my pride and my business consume me, and when I finally realized what I had lost, it was too late." Ethan stood stiffly, his gaze firm but wounded. "You never came. Every night I wondered if my father even cared that I was out there, hungry, cold, forgotten. And every night I told myself not to hope." Adrian's chest tightened. For years he had been praised as a titan of industry, a man who conquered every challenge. But in that moment, stripped of wealth and reputation, he was just a father staring at the boy he had abandoned. "I was wrong," Adrian admitted, his voice breaking. "All the money, the power, it blinded me. I thought providing riches would make me a good man, but I never gave you what mattered most. Forgive me, Ethan. Please forgive me." For a moment, Ethan turned away, his jaw tight. His young shoulders carried the weight of years of loneliness. Then, slowly, he faced Adrian again. His eyes glistened, but his voice was steady. "I didn't want your money. I didn't want your name. All I ever wanted was a father." The words pierced Adrian's heart. He reached forward, hesitating at first, then placing his hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. For the first time in years, he felt the warmth of connection, not through wealth, not through contracts, but through blood and love. "I swear to you," Adrian whispered, "I'll never let you go again. Whatever happens in this courtroom, whatever the world says about me, I will stand beside you, not as a billionaire, not as Adrian Cole the magnate, but as your father." Ethan searched his father's eyes, and for the first time he didn't see arrogance or distance. He saw sincerity, raw and vulnerable. Slowly he nodded. "Then don't prove it with words, prove it with your life." Adrian pulled him into an embrace, one that was long overdue. The weight of regret hung heavy, but in that embrace was also the seed of redemption. Two broken lives, stitched together not by wealth, but by truth and forgiveness. Outside, the trial would continue. Enemies still waited, schemes still threatened. But in that private chamber, a father and son had finally found each other. And that bond, fragile yet unbreakable, would become Adrian's greatest strength in the battles ahead. When the recess ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. What once felt like Adrian Cole's burial ground now carried the spark of truth. The whispers of conspiracy that Ethan had unveiled lingered in every corner. All eyes turned to the judge as he re-entered, his gavel striking once more. "Proceed," he commanded. Adrian's defense attorney rose, carrying a heavy folder. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we present evidence obtained from internal records of Cole Industries. These documents were uncovered only days ago, but combined with the testimony of Ethan Cole, they prove the existence of deliberate sabotage orchestrated by members of the board, most notably Mr. Victor Harrington." Gasps filled the chamber as copies of the documents were handed to the judge. They revealed doctored accounts, falsified signatures, and secret transfers to offshore banks. Every piece pointed not to Adrian's guilt, but to a calculated scheme to frame him. The prosecutor stood in protest. These claims are desperate attempts to shift blame. But the judge silenced him. Sit down, we will examine the evidence. One by one, witnesses were called. The timid maid from the Golden Crest repeated her testimony with growing confidence. A former accountant came forward, trembling, but admitting he had been bribed to alter records. Each word was another nail in the coffin of Harrington's lies. Finally, the judge leaned forward, eyes sharp as steel. "Mr. Harrington, do you deny your involvement in this conspiracy?" Victor Harrington's voice cracked under the pressure. I did what I thought was necessary for the company." The courtroom erupted in shouts. Adrian remained silent, his gaze fixed on Ethan, who sat proudly at his side. The boy's courage had torn open a fortress of deceit. Order was restored, and the judge spoke with finality. "After reviewing the testimony and evidence, it is clear that Adrian Cole has been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. The charges against him are hereby dismissed." The sound that followed was deafening, cheers, sobs, and cries of relief. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of months of shame lifting from his shoulders. Then he felt a small hand slip into his. Ethan, smiling through tears, whispered, "I told you, Father, the truth always comes out." The judge's voice rose again, solemn but proud. "Let this be a reminder to all, truth does not always come from riches or power, but from those who have suffered most. Today it was the courage of a boy, once homeless, now reunited with his father, that restored justice." Bailiffs moved swiftly as Harrington and his accomplices were placed under arrest. Their downfall was swift and merciless, their reputations shattered. Adrian stood, no longer the broken man who had entered the trial weeks earlier. He was cleared, not only in the eyes of the law but in the heart of the son he had regained. As father and son walked out of the courtroom together, cameras flashed and questions poured from reporters. But for Adrian, none of it mattered. The greatest victory was not his freedom, not the preservation of his empire, but the bond restored with Ethan. For the first time in years, Adrian Cole walked forward not as a billionaire, but as a father.